All right, thank you for the techno. Welcome, everyone. They did warn us that these lights were bright, but I just didn't listen quite enough. I think we're all having a moment of, of letting our pupils and irises adjust. Thank you so much for coming here. We've been at CCC, I'm Roy Kaufman. I'm Managing Director of both Business Development and Government Relations at Copyright Clearance Center. We've been talking about AI a lot for the last 3 years, and every time I come to Frankfurt Book Fair or London Book Fair, it's a little different. And when you sit down, when you're last minute prep, 5 minutes before the thing, and you're doing your last review of what you're going to say, and then you look at the title and you're like, Licensing Accelerates Responsible AI. Maybe we should, and if you read the description, we're going to be talking about licensing and quality. I don't know, responsible AI sounds a little bit like eat your vegetables. But anyway, we're here to talk about artificial intelligence and how we can make AI better through licensing, through respect for copyright, through collaboration as opposed to pure litigation. Although, as I mentioned to people in an earlier panel I had a former boss who used to say, litigation's just another way to say hello. So we are here. We've got an amazing panel, and I'm going to do very brief introductions because they're all online, and I really don't like wasting time on that. They're going to speak for 5 to 7 minutes. I will, once they pass 7 minutes, I'll start getting a little bit fidgety, and eventually, if they keep going, I will shut them down. I warn them in advance. I'm just telling you, that's just how I roll. The order of play, we have Katrina Stevenson. She's the Deputy CEO of the Publishers Association in the UK. She's going to do less of the licensing, more of the sort of government litigation, what's going on in the world, 60 cases in 5 to 7 minutes. Followed by Mark Walford, who's the Vice President of Rights and Business Development at Sage. He's going to give us the view from a scholarly publisher. And lastly, Michael Ellis, the President of NewsText. And NewsText is really interesting in this, if you're not familiar with his company. They aggregate blogs and license them out. So they are both a licensor and a licensee. They're an aggregator. And they're an aggregator and licensing content that's mostly freely available online. So, you've got subscription content from Mark's company. Some of it's available, open access, some of it isn't. So you're going to get different perspectives. We're going to then have a little bit of discussion. First question we are going to talk about, but they won't be talking about it now, is the Anthropic case, because that's something it's a hot topic here. We'll be talking about that. We know everyone wants to talk about it. That'll be a discussion. And then we really want to open it up for questions from the floor. We have enough questions if you don't have them, but we figure maybe we want to hear what your questions are, not just what our questions are. And with that, Katrina.
Thanks. Thank you for having me. I think, as you said, my part of this is perhaps the part of the title that refers to uncertain times. I'm going to set the scene a little bit by talking about what we mean by that, and particularly with reference to, firstly, what's going on in the UK, where our association is based. But this is, a familiar pattern in the sense that it's something that governments around the world are grappling with. So in the UK, at the very end of last year, the government put out a consultation on AI and copyright, so tail end of last year, and gave us about 2 months to respond. And it set out 4 options for how it should approach AI and copyright, specifically around the use of copyright-protected works in the training and development and operation of AI models, large language models. But the government indicated a preference for one of these options, for the creation of a new exception to copyright with a rights holder opt-out, sort of akin to the EU law. And indicating that caused a huge backlash, culminating in what you may have heard of called the Make It Fair campaign, in which sort of major newspapers backed by major artists and authors spoke out to to sort of seek to safeguard creators' rights, and was supported by Paul McCartney and Richard Osman and Elton John and all sorts of other high-profile names, and splashed on the front of every newspaper in the UK on deadline day for responding to the consultations, the 25th of February. Having copyright on the front page of any newspaper is sort of remarkable, but having it on the front page of every newspaper in the UK is not something I thought I'd ever see. But in terms of where we are now, we are still awaiting the response to that consultation from the government. It received 11,500 responses, which is sort of almost unheard of for a consultation like that. And it's still formally considering its response to it. And in the meantime, sort of a couple of other things developments have happened, which are worth mentioning. The first one is another piece of legislation called the Data Bill, which was passing through Houses of Parliament in the spring. And this drew sort of parliamentary scrutiny around the issues, specifically issues around transparency and the need for provisions that require transparency around how AI models have been trained. And what happened was supportive parliamentarians in the UK's House of Lords tabled provisions around transparency for inclusion in that bill. And the amendments actually went back and forth between the House of Lords and the House of Commons in the UK 6 times and got voted down by the government on each occasion. And the House of Lords eventually had to withdraw because it's not the democratic house. But this has been very helpful in terms of attracting support for transparency and the need for it. So even though these particular amendments to that bill failed, the level of parliamentary scrutiny there was really helpful and has brought a number of supporters to the cause. Second thing that's happened is that the government has held 3 roundtables with AI companies and rights holders, and the Publishers Association has been part of that, as of many other associations that impact our sector. And now what's proposed to happen is that there will be some technical working groups that will take place, one around transparency and one around technical solutions. We still don't know exactly what that means, and possibly also one around licensing, or that's still to be confirmed. We don't expect the consultation response imminently. I think probably it will be the new year before we see that. Final thing just to say is we have got a new AI minister in the UK. He is really engaged in the brief, but what worries us about it is that he appears not to really see the value of each piece of content to these AI models in the way that we understand it. He sees that as sort of marginal, like a few pence, and really needs sort of some convincing in terms of the value of the content. So that's something that we're very mindful of. It's possible that government will bring forward new legislation, new AI legislation in the next parliamentary session, so in a year, but that it remains to be seen what that will be and to what extent it will attempt to address the copyright issue. For now, our top priority is continuing to impress upon government the need for transparency. And although the tech lobby sort of do seem to be receptive to this in some ways, it tends to be they're sort of pushing it on to the kind of need for transparency around outputs, whereas we're trying to keep the focus on transparency around inputs. So that's a quick kind of canter through of what's happening in the UK. And I'm actually co-chair of the International Publishers Association Copyright Committee, and we very much see that this is pretty typical of what's going on elsewhere, in the sense that governments are trying to solve this issue. And as Roy said, that's combined with over 60 pieces of litigation that we now know to be ongoing around the world, which, every week we're sort of seeing new things, and that probably will continue until there's more certainty. And against that backdrop, we then, of course, have licensing happening. It's being developed on both an individual and a collective basis, and there's this really clear emerging market with willing buyers and willing sellers. But there does remain this sort of evidence of bad actors dominating the landscape and sort of using the lack of regulation for their own economic gain and growth. So hopefully that is a good jumping off point for a discussion about licensing.
Excellent, thank you. And I think we'll get to some discussion of the interplay between licensing and the legal environment, whether that legal environment is regulatory or legislative or litigation, because it sort of becomes all the same approach. I was amused. This report, the last effort by the UK government, to ask people, whether they need a new copyright exception was like, here's 4 ideas, 3 are stupid, and this is the good one. What do you think? And it was, in my career, the 3rd go-round I've been involved on that. And the second one was only 2 years ago where they tried this. That's where you and I think, first met. And they were told no. And they said, and we said, oh, just wait. Next time there's a new government, we're going to see this again. And so it's kind of interesting, but we do see the same thing everywhere in a national flavor. So with that, we're going to now go to licensing, and Mark.
Thank you. And thank you, Katrina. That was quite a nice setup for me in terms of the licensing landscape. And I have no idea of the kind of experience of the audience in terms of licensing and so on. So if some of this is irrelevant to you, please just ignore it. But the first thing I wanted to make was really that when it comes to this sort of licensing, it's the same as other licensing. And there are different routes to market. There are direct routes, which as publishers, we're familiar with. There are indirect routes via intermediaries, agents, and so on. And there's also collective licensing. And I would be very remiss not to mention the collective licensing element, not least because of the hosts of this panel. But this is, I mean, you were talking about AI 3 years ago. I didn't know about AI 3 years ago. And this has been something of a kind of roller coaster where every so often a new term appears and then suddenly it's everywhere and so on. And we all started talking about this, thinking about training of LLMs and how there was this opportunity, there was also this threat and this kind of feeling this has already been done. And how do we undo it? How do we retrieve ourselves from this situation? We've moved on a bit from that. There's been talk all this week around RAG, retrieval augmented generation, and those deals supplanting what's going to happen with training deals. But as a rights holder, I'm still waiting to see where those are and what they might look like. And maybe, Michael, you'll have more information on that, because I can imagine that might fit with your model more. But so the stuff which emerges, and we think, wow, this is the next thing. Forget about training. That's all done. But it's not. And the thing of that RAG was the thing a few months ago, and now the thing is model context protocol. And this potentially for scholarly publishers like Sage is a real issue. It's how so much of our revenue is tied up in, the primary revenue is tied up in subscriptions. And we've gone to huge lengths with our subscribers to develop standardized usage metrics. And they look at usage and they think, well, we're not going to subscribe to that anymore because we're not getting any usage. Or they'll go, great, yeah, that's the usage on this is really good. And we think, okay, well, maybe there's an uplift in price and so on. But MCP potentially cuts the publisher's platform out of the loop. And this is still to be kind of explored, is what happens if the usage, if you like, if the users are still using the content, but they're using it via ChatGPT or they're using it via a third party, and our relationship is not directly with the user, it's with the library. So I think there's a challenge there, which I don't yet have an answer to. Do we go into MCP? Do we not go into MCP? Do we try it? Do we, that stuff. I wanted to...
Katrina.
Yeah, that's kind of how I feel about MCP. I know we're probably going to talk a bit about the Anthropic settlement, but the thing I wanted to mention about it is, aside from the fair use question, it's not settled, but is just what this has done in terms of publicity. So publishers we have a lot of relationships, but primary relationships are with our authors. And authors have been interested in AI for some time, but it's one thing for authors to be interested in AI. It's another thing to think that large numbers of them are going to get contacted by the settlement administrator and the Anthropic settlement to say, what do you want to do about your book, and do you have the rights? And that's not something publishers have had to deal with before. And it will vary depending on what sort of publisher you are. Scholarly publishers generally have the rights, but it's one thing for a publisher to have the rights, it's another thing for the author to know that the publisher has the rights. And there's a challenge there if authors say, well, I think I'll opt out of the settlement and I'll get my publisher to sue Anthropic instead. Because it could happen, or at least the first part could happen. I'm not so sure about the second part. So as publishers, we need to think about how we handle authors who are now much more aware, and it's gone from a kind of supposition that content has been used to an accepted fact that content has been used, and then expectation management around what does that mean for the publisher-author relationship. So that feels to me pretty important. And that takes me to my final point, which is really just to kind of, I think most of this is good. I can remember conversations a couple of years ago where the idea was, okay, this is a little bit like Spotify or Napster or whatever. There's going to have to be litigation, and what will hopefully come out of this is some sort of functioning licensing market. And that does seem to be what's happening. And in common with other licensing markets, there are direct and there are intermediate and there are collective routes to that. So I'm positive about it. But I think there's still a lot of interesting challenges to get through.
Yeah, thank you, Mark. Yeah, I am also positive about this. I mean, sometimes when you get into these discussions, the scope of what I would call flat-out piracy and infringement is so great that you can lose track of the fact that if we can get AI into licenses, and I had this conversation with a lot of governments. They're like, I said, well, this is just a licensing event, and they said, well, do you have a license for it? I said, they broke it. They didn't just come and ask for a license. It's back to your concept of it's new. No publisher is going to spend money. CCC is not going to spend money creating a collective license for something we don't know exists. The moment we knew it existed, we found out it existed, at least in this sort of large Gen AI thing, as opposed to sort of this traditional text and data mining, which we've been licensing for well over a decade. The moment, they said, there's no licensing market for this. I'm like, well, yeah, you just made that up. So, of course, there's no licensing market. Could there have been a licensing market? Of course, you should have come to us. And as I always say to governments, publishers always want a license. That's what they do for a living. You can't license if there's no buyer. You need someone to write the check, or you don't have a license. And with that, someone who I think has been engaged a little bit more closely with, you're a platform, you're a licensor, probably people you're licensing are licensing AI. Maybe they have that right, maybe they don't. Michael, talk to us about how you're seeing all of this.
Sure, Roy. So NewsText is a content curation and licensing platform. We enable the commercial use of content from the open web. That content is more or less 100% freely accessible to the general public. And so that makes it a use case completely and utterly different from yours, Mark. And what we try to do is find ways forward in various arrangements with our customers and through organizations like CCC. We work with approximately 850 publishers who publish content on 1,500 websites. We deliver this content, so we have a license agreement with every single publisher, and we deliver the content to mainly information libraries and research services, so folks like LexisNexis or Thomson Reuters Westlaw. We also work in the academic space with ProQuest and Cengage Gale, and in financial markets with London Stock Exchange Group and Moody's. So this content is licensed, it's delivered to these platforms. We get license fees for this, and we share some of that revenue with the publishers. that's how things work. That's how they have worked for the last 20 years since we were founded in 2004. Come along, AI. So what is AI? I had this analogy in my mind about it, like if you've ever done a cold plunge at the spa, you know, like you dip your toe in and it's freezing cold, and that's like the coldest moment, and then maybe you wade in further and it's invigorating, and suddenly a few minutes later it doesn't feel cold anymore. And I wanted to say that's what AI licensing is going to be for all of us over the course of the next 20 years. And as I was thinking about it, as the panelists were speaking, I thought, actually, I think it's more like being tossed into the cold plunge. I mean, that's like how it feels, and we're all scrambling and trying to figure out where we're going to land with this. So the publishers that we work with, I mean, by definition, I think they're more flexible. They're more willing to try out different arrangements and see what's possible here. I would offer kind of a basic framework, at least in our experience, of the components that make a successful arrangement possible. I mean, trust is the biggest word. People are always talking about this, and I will offer a couple of ways in which I've seen trust supported in some of these arrangements. The second has to do with capabilities, and I think that's a lot what Mark was speaking about. My basic notion here is that publishers are being asked to be tech companies, or more like tech companies. And I think the tech companies are being asked to be more like publishers, hopefully, and share each other's concerns. And then the third is in the area of reward. I mean, what value is going to be generated here, and how is it going to be shared? So when it comes to trust, there were kind of two things within that concept where I've seen some progress made in the deals that we've done so far. One is just basic communication. I know it sounds simple, but sometimes tech companies don't know how to talk to publishers, and vice versa. So if you are a publisher and you get, a proposal from a tech company, I think having a basic template in place, like an RFP of how you would like to be pitched to, is extremely important. And the most successful deals I've seen have had good communication at the start. The second has to do with data. So to what extent is data being used? How is it being shared? How is it being protected? We have one tech platform that we work with that solved this in a technical capacity. So they actually can do what they need to do with the content. They can extract claims and facts from this content, produce some metadata out of it, and then they actually discard the original work. The entire original content is discarded after 24 hours. And that's a big trust building measure as well. In the area of capability, here's where I was hoping the analogy with the cold plunge would work. I think you need to decide whether you're going to put your toe in the water, if you're going to wade further in, or if you're going to dive in. A lot of the publishers that we work with, they don't necessarily have the resource to become tech companies in their own right, or take on some of these capabilities. So that's where NewsText comes in. We help them in the provision of metadata, and also offer some advice on what sort of content should be licensed in which use cases. If you have more resources, I think you should be wading into the water, at least in-house, so that you're more able to, I think, fluently speak with tech companies when you're negotiating some of these deals, if you're trying to do a direct deal with a tech company. And then there are some cases I've seen of publishers that are really diving in. So I don't know if you've read about what The Economist has been doing lately. But I mean, they're outspoken about not doing any licensing deals for their content. They are, they've got content on Substack now. They've got, I think it's called The Economist Insider, where they're producing their own in-house content in reaction to the changing AI environment, and they've even got their own AI lab, right? So they're really diving into becoming or building some of these tech capabilities in their own right. And then when it comes to reward, I think this is the area that's like the big question mark. I will mention one company I think is interesting. You may have heard of ProRata. Those of you in the room who have not, you can look them up. They are developing basically like a Shazam for AI answers. Right? So it listens to the answer, and then it determines, which publishers are responsible for what percentage of that answer. they're doing an independent study of their tech to determine, to be able to prove to people that this is actually something that people can trust, to go back to that word. But I think part of the reason that the question about rewards is unanswered goes back to the thing about capability. So to what extent is the publisher, contributing to the end product? To what extent is the tech company? Because I think the issue is the end user's experience is now a result of both. I mean, the tech company is responsible for the experience of the reader or the researcher, and the content is also very important in that mix, right? So licensing is no longer really about access alone. It's about the way in which these players interact with each other. I think the question about reward will only really be answered once some of those questions around capability are answered. So that's what I would have to say.
Okay. Timer went off. There we go. All right. Do you need another few minutes, or are you
No,
good?
that's it.
I just love having someone on the panel who's talking about what it's going to be like in 20 years. It's good to be young. You got two young people. No offense, Mark.
It's too late. It's too late for
on
me.
this side. Yeah, it's interesting. They're trust and quality are sort of two words that come up a lot, and they have different meanings, just as AI has different meanings. We say AI as if it's a thing, but it's an open AI system, which is hoovered up all the the entirety of the web, the good, the bad, the ugly. Then you have systems like ProRata, which are using licensing to get content, and of course the content they're getting is validated content, validated because it might be peer reviewed or because there's an editorial standard or what have you. And so there's trust in the deal. You have to trust who you're sitting across from. As a user, you have to trust what you're using. We work with a lot of corporations and pharma. They need to know whatever they're using, whatever may be right or wrong with it, it has to be the most trustworthy content they can use. Whether it's 100% accurate or not, it's got to have the best markers. So that's kind of an interesting concept. And I do want to very briefly, because I have said, we've talked about Anthropic a tiny bit, and then I want to get back to sort of the I think, more positive things about licensing. But the last few days, I've had a lot of conversations with publishers, and so just since there's publishers in this room, if you've got books that may have been in the Books 3 data set, do go to the website, look up if you're entitled to money. And one publisher I was talking to, I don't know if he's here, I'd actually never met him, but he was one of our big licensors. And a lot of books, each one doesn't sell for that much money, but in the aggregation, nice business. It's like, wow, if I have 100 or 200 books in this, which he does, times $3,000, times maybe there's going to be some more settlements, I'm actually getting some decent money. And as Mark has said, I think it's the litigation that's going to resolve this sometime eventually. I say 5 to 6 years. I don't believe that. I think it's going to be longer before and we're never going to, at least in the US, have clear rules, because that's not how fair use works. Fair use is fact determinate, so every case will be different. So Anthropic case, which is books, well, if it was a journals publisher who had been selling text and data mining rights of their XML for 10 years, believe me, it would have been a different result from that judge. But unfortunately, I call you a publisher for the sake of this, your rights are being determined by people litigating on behalf of book publishers who probably don't even know copyright law very well, although they're learning and they have been bringing in some of the experts. So the whole world is really weird, but licensing, to bring all this back, to me, I would say this, of course, but it's true, and it's where, and it's one of our guiding principles at CCC. Licensing makes markets function. The clients who come to us, who come to you guys, they come to you because they want to be copyright compliant. They're willing to pay. They have to get value. There's a negotiation. It's not this person, the person who's never going to pay, the person who's uploading books through a data set, they're never your customer. They never would have been, and they're not going to be. But how do you, work with them? And then, Katrina, I know I'm just sort of talking. When you're talking to a government, and I would say it's the same with the court, how does the evidence of a licensing market factor into your discussions with them?
Yeah, I think. Can you still hear me?
No, I think it needs to be closer.
Now?
No. Okay. Can we get a hands mic? And Mark, answer that question. You meet with governments.
I don't spend much time with governments, but I think for me it comes down to, we know the AI companies have been doing so much lobbying. I heard an example earlier this week, it may even be from you, Roy, about Denmark basically sending an ambassador to Silicon Valley who now works for Microsoft. And this is the extent of it. Yeah. So to me, it comes down to, on one level, the simple thing, if the government minister is going to, at some point, say, these AI companies say I can't get a license, to which the only satisfactory answer is, here it is.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think licensing is the answer, and fundamentally important to being able to communicate why we don't need an exception to copyright law in order to make this market work. So we have always and continue to push forward that message that licensing is the appropriate mechanism for the development of this market in a legal, ethical, sustainable, secure manner, and that has to be and should be the starting point. And you introduce exceptions to copyright where you have market failure, and we don't have market failure here. We have an emerging market that's expanding at pace. So I think the answer to that is that the licensing framework is hugely important, and it's good for us to be able to show that is the case on both kind of individual direct licensing basis and also the collective licenses that are under development. I think as well, you mentioned Anthropic. Transparency is super important, obviously, to unlocking licensing, right? Particularly for the content that's sort of already been taken and already been used. And what's interesting about Anthropic is that in order to enable this settlement, Anthropic actually handed over a copy of the data set which it had used in the training of its model. And it still had that 3 years on, which is contrary to, a lot of the sort of big tech lobby claims that, oh, well, we don't have this information, we don't store that information, we don't keep that information. Well, there's an example of, a big AI company that in fact does, and you just have to read the summary judgment summary judgment ruling to see all the references to the fact that it had this data set and it kept this data set. So I think in some ways that's an interesting sort of outcome from the settlement, right? That it sort of demonstrates the feasibility of transparency in a really interesting way, and that also helps to unlock licensing. So from that point of view, it is helpful. And to my comments earlier about our new AI minister not really valuing the value of each individual piece of content that goes in, a settlement with big numbers attached to it for training of AI models is not unhelpful, albeit 1.5 billion is sort of lunch money to a company whose value is over 180 billion, but that's probably for another question.
Yeah, it's lunch money to them. It isn't lunch money to us. And I got to tell you, from a copyright licensing agency point of view, that's a really nice headline number, because again, we're talking to people who want to be compliant and understand there's a risk. And there's a lot of nuance, and I think that's not for this panel as to what that case actually says, because I disagree with a lot of it, but it's also, it's a very interesting headline number.
Could I just add, I think one really important takeaway to remember about the Anthropic settlement is it's just in relation to the use of pirated works. It's not in relation to the more general training practices. And in particular, Anthropic is walking away from that case with the summary judgment finding that ripping the bindings off books and scanning them in, using that to train a model is fair use without an appeal risk. So because they're settling the case. So we just have to bear in mind, that limitation of it, and think, I think really carefully about any further litigation that's brought, that is done in the right way.
Yeah, I think there are some people who are happy with the $3,000 a book. I don't think there's anyone happy with the judgment.
I would just add, yes, proving to them that it's possible to solve this through licensing in various ways, and NewsText does that in the sense that we're talking about open web content here. And the people that we speak with, they sort of come to us and they say, our stuff has already been scraped, and they think that there's no answer, there's no compensation there, but actually there is through a license, and many of them choose to participate with us actually to prove that point. And how much the money is going to be, of course, they feel entitled to a certain amount, but they wish to be able to take away in a court of law the argument, well, that there was no alternative, right? And so they participate strictly for that reason.
Yeah, so I've always been curious, particularly vis-a-vis the content you're licensing. I get from the supply side why publishers would of course want to license AI rights because they know their material has been scraped and used. So that's should be an easier decision than it sometimes is. We all live this world, right? But leaving that aside, on the buy side, what are the conversations you're having with the buyer where they've probably already used your content, or if they haven't, because they're trying to do the right thing, in quotes, and I'm not sure everyone would agree with me when I say it that way, but we're in a publishing meeting, so I'm going to say do the right thing. They do the right thing, their competitors don't. Where are they? So how does that conversation happen? This fascinates me.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think it comes down to quality. A word that you mentioned before. The tech platforms that we work with are interested in producing the highest quality result. And in order to do that, you got to have a relationship with the publishers that are producing the content. And so that's why they come to us, because they want to do the right thing, of course, but they also know that it's the best thing in the end for the product. And it kind of goes back then to what I was saying before about this cold plunge. I'm not going to lose the analogy. They're in there and they recognize that they need you. We need each other in order to produce the result that they wish to see. I'll also just say there are plenty that come to us who they really need an education. What is copyright? How does it work? People actually pay these license fees. They're completely unfamiliar with it. So yeah, there's an important element of that as well.
And thank you for that. This leads me into a shameless plug for copyright.com/AI, I believe. But if you go to our website, yeah, my colleagues are nodding, yes. We started with the education before the licenses, then the licenses. Back to what you're saying, Katrina, for years, I'd flap my arms and say, you can get a license for this, but there's no better proof of the ability to license something than an actual license, right? So actually having proof, I always say to people, license through us, license on your own, and just tell people about it, promote it, do a press release so that we all can prove that there is a licensing market. A lot of this is done obviously confidentially under NDAs, and there are good business reasons to do that, but the more we can kind of establish this. So what you're talking about with quality sort of gets back to, a little bit, Mark was sort of talking about, model context protocol and RAG, which are, when they train the models on every word they could find legally or illegally, and dark web and everything else. Sorry, she's not the dark web. She was pointing out to me earlier that they trained on the dark web. So there's all this horrible stuff, and that's why when you come out with a system, where anyone can use it for free, and it's writing up term papers, and it makes mistakes. I will not, use the anthropomorphic word that the tech companies forced on us for their errors in programming and content choice. So it makes mistakes. And again, I would say for at least the publishers I work with, the student term paper market is not our core licensing market. So our core licensing market, whether it's a bank or a fuel company or an engineering firm, they want to use this system to ask a question to get back an answer that they can rely on and take action on. And I think that's where MCP, we don't have to talk about that. We can talk about RAG, where you're making a query and then you're getting an answer, and the answer comes with an attribution to a Sage journal. And they're like, oh, that's a Sage journal, that's trusted. And that is, I feel like this whole big training stuff, it's just litigation. That's going to be solved by the courts with some settlements and some licenses. But the big picture, that ship is on its course. And that the next course is people who have money and need to pay and do something, and therefore need the best stuff they can because they need their answers to be as good as they can be. So I think your content, but before that, Mark, I'm thinking like Sage content, journal, peer-reviewed stuff.
Yeah. The thing that strikes me about all of this is the word trust, and the sense in which if we're looking to AI companies, well, on some level, how can we trust them? Because they've taken our content already. And so litigation then becomes the obvious way in which to bring them to heel. If you're talking to government, well, we need transparency over inputs because we don't trust those AI companies because of what they've done, but also because if you're if people are looking on whatever they're looking on, ChatGPT or whatever, saying, well, I'd like to know what to do about diabetes, they want to know that the content that it's being trained on is not just Facebook or whatever. So the trust thing, Michael, your trusted content providers and then your customers who are essentially trusting you to select the trusted content. From our point of view, the authors who are trusting us to make, they entrust us with their rights in order that we license them responsibly to benefit the author and to get the author's work out there. So this whole thing is held together by trust, and to some extent, the intrusion of these actors whose only motivation is their own success has made this very, very kind of complex. But there is still this way through, which is licensing.
Sorry, I've lost track of time. Please, someone ask a question. Good, we've got a question.
Hey, Casper from OUP. I have a question, interesting conversation. I wonder if you have any advice. So one of the bits of scuttlebutt around Hall 4 is that there is a player or there are players who are going to wholesalers or a retailer and purchasing single copies in bulk of they're placing a huge order, but for one copy. It's pretty clear that this is, these are AI hyperscalers or foundation AI model developers. And I'm just curious if you have advice on what's an appropriate response for publishers? Is there anything that you recommend we do? It seems like we don't have very many tools to address this. We kind of have a sense of why they're doing this and making this purchase. So I'm just curious if you have any thoughts on what each of us should be doing, and then if there is anything collectively that we should be doing.
So this happened already. In the Anthropic case that we talked about, that was the language that we hated. That's now, which is that Tom Turvey, who people might remember from our industry and from Google Books, literally went to a book wholesaler, said, sell me one of everything, scanned it, and that court said that that's fair use. Now, we do have another circuit decision in a slightly different case, which is the Internet Archive, saying you can't do that. So again, everything's a mess and everything's fact determinate. I wish I had a good answer. I mean, I've had this conversation with a number of the publishers, you know, and I would not judge anyone who says, don't buy my book, although, you know, you can go on to ABE or something else. Like, for convenience, they might be going to your book distributor and buying them, but, you know, depends how committed they are to getting your book. They're going to get your book, right? And, yeah, they probably still have the pirated version anyway. And so I wouldn't judge someone and say, no, I'm going to make it harder. I wouldn't judge someone for saying, you know, by the way, you're my publisher. You might not know that. You know, and my book costs $200, and that's $200, right? That's not bad. So I wish I had a great answer, because it's very hard to stop the behavior. But it is something worth thinking about. And the one publisher I was talking to said, we're just telling them no. It's just not worth it. We don't want to do this.
And the irony is that for that $200 book, if you think about the prices that publishers are getting for certain types of content and certain training kind of deals, it's actually not, it's beneficial to maybe both parties to think about a licensing arrangement where they get metadata, they get standardized files, they get kind of all of this in a way that is good for them. It might not actually even be that much more expensive for them. So I mean, but it is interesting in the wake of the summary judgment, to have a couple of these big bulk orders that come in really shakes the foundation of that good faith sense that a lot of players are kind of, they really want to make this work. Well, what they really want to do is make it work for them. And, I understand the ecosystem we have right now, but it's just so delicate that and I wonder if there's a way we should be responding to this. That we don't have any power, I don't think, but I do think that we could. I don't know how we should respond to those orders.
Trade association, go ahead.
Well, I suppose the first thing to say is, obviously, this is an area we need to be really careful in, because in terms of recommending any action and/or acting collectively because of competition law. So I'm sort of just putting that point there first. I think, obviously, the Anthropic summary judgment finding the activity of taking off the binding and scanning stuff in being fair use. My understanding from our US counsel is that is entirely at odds with modern fair use law. And to Roy's point, there is the Internet Archive case, which is a higher court, which says something totally different. And there's the Warhol decision in the Supreme Court, and there's a body of law that suggests that finding, with respect, is not correct. And so I suppose in terms of thinking about a response, one response is to make that point that that finding in that case, if that's what this is based upon, is there is better and more accurate and more reliable articulations of the law. I mean, from a practical point of view as well, I should say, by the way, I'm anecdotally aware of this happening, so it's certainly not just one company, but I guess, requiring that the distributor or whoever it is, refer the buyer directly to the publisher so that they can't kind of fulfill the order if they get this kind of odd request as well, might be just another step to sort of, at least then you have the decision with you, and you can consider whether actually you do want to say no, because obviously the price will be different. And then in terms of collective action, well, in some ways I feel like that lies with us, as an industry, and to think about bringing good cases, bringing better cases. To me, it shows the importance of really targeted copyright claims in these cases, so that we bring good facts and we get good law out the other end. So, getting some more findings of the law going the right way. I know that's a longer term thing, but that ultimately will help.
We're out of time. So, thank you, everyone.
Thank you.